So there I was, scratching the bottom of the barrel for content, writing my master's thesis on whether or not Genshin Impact players watch videos before rating them, when it hit me. If I can't say whatever I want in the Genshin community, I'll just use confirmation bias instead. With that being said, Hoyoverse bad, Kokomi is a main DPS, and Melt Ayaka's pretty strong. You guys seem to really like my Genshin Needs PvP video, so we're gonna explore other forms of future content as well, namely raids. Rather than just talk about why they'd be good for Genshin though, I want to talk about how they could be implemented and what options Hoyoverse would have. If you feel inclined, I'd love to hear what the ideal raid looks like for you down in the comments below. Before we talk about Genshin raids and what they could look like though, I want to give some context to the term raid as it relates to RPGs. Raids in past games have usually been meant to challenge the player base. Some games even have different levels of raids ranging from easy to hard difficulty. But what exactly are raids? If you're unfamiliar with them, raids are generally challenge content that features powerful enemies and cooperative play. Typically, they'll be something you can only do once you've reached max level, since they're meant to be the highest level challenging content. In most games I've done raids in, RuneScape, Destiny, World of Warcraft, and Final Fantasy XIV, there's usually a pretty big damage check. Now, damage checks already exist in Genshin Impact. Spiral Abyss is a damage check. The game is checking if you're able to do enough damage to defeat enemies before the timer hits a certain point. Usually in raids, rather than give you a score though, once bosses' timers run out, they'll enrage and your co-op team will be completely wiped. For bosses with tough mechanics, a lot of players need to record their wipes, which brings us to today's sponsor, SteelSeries Moments. With SteelSeries Moments, you're able to quickly capture moments in your games, cut them, and share them with minimal effort. Of all the programs I've tried for capturing amazing moments in my gameplay, SteelSeries Moments has been the most consistent and easy to use. If you're doing polls on Genshin Impact in a Discord call with friends and you suddenly get a double 5-star 10 poll, you're gonna want to capture that and send it around, right? Moments can capture back when that happened, easily allow you to trim it to the right size and share it with whoever you want. SteelSeries Moments is one app for everything, an all-in-one program for capturing those moments you don't want to forget. There's also an auto-clipping feature that you can turn on or off that detects when something awesome happens, like a multi-kill in a shooter or a 10 pull in Genshin Impact. Speaking of Genshin Impact, SteelSeries is giving away codes for in-game loot when you download Moments. It's free to download, so if you want some in-game goodies, make sure to download SteelSeries Moments to grab your code. On top of that, every single day in the month of June, SteelSeries is giving away special gear to a lucky winner. You'll automatically be entered to win when you redeem the Genshin Impact code, so I highly recommend you download SteelSeries Moments, redeem that code, and give it a try. Thanks to SteelSeries for sponsoring this video, and let's talk more in depth about raids. Game developers can opt for just a boss fight at any time, but some devs will turn raids into sequences of bosses. If you look at a game like Final Fantasy XIV, raids take you straight into the boss fight where you have to be very focused on the mechanics of the boss, also with occasional puzzles to solve mid-fight. Overall, once you've had enough practice, the fight becomes easy though. There are other games though where raids will be just damage checks, where there's not a lot of mechanics to learn at all and you just have to dish out enough damage in time based on your gear and level. For developers, a choice has to be made for accessibility, and that usually determines whether the boss is just an HP sponge that soaks a ton of damage or a boss with actual mechanics. For more casual games, spongy bosses tend to be favored by developers, whereas in games where there's many different levels of challenging content, developers will often try to create raids with mechanics for entire co-op groups to solve. This could be either really good or really bad for Genshin, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. Though I already have many popular opinions that nobody could ever possibly disagree with, this one might be kind of unpopular. My favorite raids of all time are from Destiny, where you have a series of boss fights that have lots of HP and mechanics, but also puzzles and world traversal between each fight, and also lots of chests. It all came together really well to be a long but rewarding experience, but one of the biggest issues with Destiny raids was creating raid groups. When you have raids that are difficult, you need to implement a system to help players find specific groups of players who are willing and able to learn mechanics. Raids with mechanics can take a while to figure out. They can take a while to practice. It's like choreography where everyone has to be there all the time, actively trying to learn the right way to do things together. And if we're being completely honest, that's why I'm skeptical at the idea of raids in Genshin Impact. Because ultimately, at its core, it's a casual game. That means that more likely than not, raids, if and when they're put into Genshin, will include sponge bosses, similar to the world bosses we have now. There likely won't be super interesting and complex mechanics in all the fights. Now, that's not to say there won't be anything to learn, raids do have to be harder than regular content, otherwise they're just normal content, right? With all that being said, regardless of Genshin Impact being a casual game where many players won't want to form pre-made groups to practice and learn difficult mechanics, there's still plenty of ways to implement raids that can be fun, productive, and rewarding. But there is just one more thing that could cause trouble for Hoyoverse: in-game toxicity surrounding raids. In situations where players don't have in-game text chat, toxicity isn't really a problem, but of course in co-op, there will always be players harassing each other over silly things like damage and character choice. And let's be honest guys, it's just completely unwarranted unless you play Xinyan. In raids, this would likely be even more toxic since they're meant to be even more difficult content with a higher barrier to entry. And unlike my PvP suggestion, which didn't involve people having to interact at all, raids are very interactive. In the case where there are multiple complex mechanics, players could be harassed for not doing them correctly. It could turn messy overall, which is likely part of the reason Hoyoverse is hesitant to release content like that. However, from a player standpoint, it's important to recognize that at the moment, there's barely any co-op content at all. Anything is welcome right now. Any incentive to play with friends other than co-op domains or taking their own ikabuto. So in my opinion, the bar is pretty low as it stands. As far as raids in Genshin, there's a couple ways they could be implemented. One way is to have 4 players on a team, with each player having 1 or 2 characters. If they did something like this, you'd still see normal Genshin team size, meaning there's a small enough group where each person could have their own specific job. That could be having 2 players fight off certain enemies to keep them off of a ley line while other players meet a damage check. Alternatively, there could be parkour or other puzzle elements to each fight, making them complex and super fun to learn. In a case like this, you'd probably have a boss with slightly less health than if there were no mechanics at all, just to make sure that it's not too hard to balance everything out. But in that sort of situation, it might get pretty tough for Hoyoverse, because Genshin at its core is a casual mobile game, and Hoyoverse wants to make the game simple and easier for both more casual and mobile players. I learned recently that mobile gamers are built different, but there's still enough casual mobile players that this sort of challenging raid content probably wouldn't fly. So let's try something else. Another way I'd like to see raids implemented is by having 6 to 8 players fighting a boss instead of your standard 4. That would make raids larger scale battles, which would be pretty dang cool. The downside of this method is that by having more players, your fight has to have less difficult mechanics. Most games with multiple sizes of raids have more mechanics in the smaller raids and less challenging mechanics in the larger ones. That's mostly just because it's easier to coordinate a smaller group of players than it is a larger group, so having more players in a Genshin raid might turn the boss into a damage sponge rather than a big brain raid boss. It could also be tough on hardware and servers to have over 4 people in one place. To be completely honest, I'm not sure if this is something their servers could handle, but maybe I'm completely wrong and they could upgrade them to be able to handle such large scale content, but for the time being, I don't think we should expect it. If Hoyoverse added raids to the game, they would likely end up using a bit of both scenarios. The easiest thing for them to do to please a majority of their player base is cater to the casual crowd, because let's be honest, most of the players in this game are casual. Most of them aren't even using YouTube, Twitch at twitch.tv/Braxophone, make sure to go drop a follow, looking up build guides, or even doing Spiral Abyss. Ultimately, this approach would just mean creating bosses without very complex mechanics and still having a lot of health. That being said, because it's a raid and not just a standard boss, I do have faith that Hoyoverse would add some sort of mechanics to the fight to make it more than just a glorified world boss. I also think that if Hoyoverse does add raids, as cool as it would be to have more than 4 players in a raid, I don't think it's likely they'll expand server space or change core functions of the game for that. In my opinion, having 4-player raids without super complex mechanics doesn't sound like the perfect raid experience, but in the best interest of Genshin's largely casual player base, it does make the most sense. Remember guys, they nerfed the child boss fight in the main story because it was apparently too hard. And I won't lie, we were all struggling a little bit back then because the game was so new, but if they're willing to do that sort of thing, I highly doubt they're gonna make a super complex boss, even if it's meant to be the hardest content in the game. At the end of the day, any new content, and especially content that can be experienced with friends, is going to add to the Genshin Impact experience, and I hope that raids are added in some way. Even if the rewards are minuscule, even if it's for 10 heroes wits once a week, the opportunity to complete challenging content with friends is something that Genshin desperately needs. I'm hopeful that Hoyoverse will add some larger or more complex content to Genshin Impact eventually. I think it's just a matter of time. What do you think raids will look like? What would you like Genshin raids to be? Let me know in the comments down below. As usual, if you've enjoyed, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and if you like the video, I'll give you a cookie. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll catch you on the next one.